All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Suncoast Mental Health Counselors Association's webinar entitled How to Conduct a Quality Substance Abuse Evaluation. My name is Aaron Norton, for those of you who don't know me, and I am the president of the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association, and I'm the regional director for the American Mental Health Counselors Association. And then at SOMCA, the Suncoast Mental Health Counselors Association, I chair the legislative committee. And if you have questions that we do not get to today, please feel free to send me an email to this email address, aaron@nbfe.net, and I will be glad to get back with you. And it kind of looks like we've reached a plateau here, so probably you all have chimed in. 69% of you are LMHCs, or 71% of you are, 7% LCSWs. Welcome, LCSWs. 13% counseling students, and 7% other. I'm always so curious about who other might be. All right, let's move on then to the next polling question. All right, it looks like you're most interested in Objective B, learning several questions that can be asked to determine if a client meets diagnostic criteria. But there's a good amount of interest in all the other learning objectives, so that's great. We probably have a good, well-rounded setup for you then, and hopefully there's a little something for everybody in here. Next polling question. How would you describe your level of experience and confidence with substance abuse evaluations? All right, and it looks like we have a pretty popular tie for moderate experience and confidence or a little experience and confidence. 13% of you consider yourself experts, and about 6% are saying, you know, I've got very little or no experience with substance abuse evals. Great. One more polling question before we get into the slides, and then we'll have some additional polling questions later on to kind of keep you engaged as we go through here. The last polling question before we get into the slides. This one is going to be very helpful for us because we are collecting through the association's data based on the fact that we are now social distancing, of course, and we have this pandemic on our hands. We're trying to figure out how many of our members are providing services in person only, through telehealth only, through a combination of in-person and telehealth venues, or how many of you aren't seeing any clients right now at all? This is what it looks like so far. Looks like so far, the majority of you, 59%, are saying through telehealth only. Now, there are 6% who are only providing in-person clinical services, and then 17% are saying a combination of in-person and telehealth, and 22% of you are not seeing any clients right now. And I think this is very reflective of some changes because just a couple weeks ago, about half of you were still saying that you were providing in-person services. So there seems to be quite a shift going on, obviously. All right, so what are we gonna cover today? Well, first, I'm gonna pause for a moment on these slides because I'm gonna go back to the chat box. There have been a few entries there. Just make sure everybody's okay in the chat box. To get CEs, okay, yeah, so some people were chiming in on their answers. Okay, someone who's an other is licensed in another state, but not working towards getting licensed in Florida. Okay, that's good to know. And that's about it. So it looks like you guys are all set in the chat box. And then another person who said other is a registered marriage and family therapy intern. Got it. Great. So we'll proceed on. Now, as far as our objectives go, let me look at this one extra chat message. Okay, an LCSW is also on. Great. There's several LCSWs. And somebody says not seeing your chat box. So here's the deal with the chat box. If you are on a computer and you go to the bottom of your screen, you should see some options, and one of those options should say chat. If you don't see it, then you might want to click on more, and that should bring up the chat option. And then you would click on that, and then you can access our chat box. You can type, you can read, and so forth. If you're on a phone, you know, again, you would just look for the option that says chat on your Zoom app if you're on a phone or a tablet, and then you can access the chat box. All right, so our objectives, what are we going to be covering over this almost 3 hours that we have here together today? We are going to identify the diagnostic criteria for substance use disorders and apply that criteria to case scenario. We're going to learn several questions that you can ask to determine if a client meets diagnostic criteria. We're going to identify tests that you can administer in your practice for evaluations, learning to use collateral sources of information, And we're going to explore that ASAM treatment criteria that will really help you out with conceptualizing cases when you're evaluating for substance use disorders. A little terminology here about what we even mean by some of the words we're going to be using. People ask all the time, what is addiction? My way of defining the word addiction is to say that addiction is any pattern of behavior that an individual repeatedly engage in that activates reward circuitry in the brain, even though they're experiencing significant negative consequences in major life areas. I think that's a good definition for addiction. And in that sense, again, any behavior that activates reward circuitry in the brain is potentially addictive behavior. This even includes some very healthy behaviors in life that can still become problematic. You could take exercise, for example. Just because somebody feels like they have to or need to exercise every day doesn't mean they're addicted to exercise. It could be a very healthy habit. But what if somebody's exercising in a way that's actually producing significant negative consequences in major life areas, but they can't stop nonetheless? I guess a great example of this, very old example maybe in a way, there was that show Friends that a lot of you I'm sure have probably seen. And at one point, there was a character who was dating a man who was very wealthy. And this man was training to be a champion in the UFC, Ultimate Fighting Championship. And he wasn't very good. So he would get the crap beat out of him every time that he would compete. He would end up in the hospital severely injured, and he would get right out there and do it again, over and over again. You could make the case, maybe this behavior has reached the point of addiction. Similarly, there are people who they get injured maybe because they're excessively exercising or exercising in an unhealthy way. They have to be on bed rest for a while in order for their body to heal, but they cannot suppress the need or desire to exercise. So they go off and run and then damage themselves even more. And then history repeats itself. So even something as healthy as exercise could be potentially addictive because it is a behavior that activates reward circuitry in the brain for many people. Same thing with food, same thing with sex, same thing with gambling, same thing with any of these potentially addictive substances. Any substance that produces a high or euphoria is a potentially addictive substance. Period. End of story. By the way that we define addiction. Now, the American Psychiatric Association has a great definition for substance use disorders in the DSM. Their DSM definition is they would define substance use disorders as having an essential feature that involves a cluster of cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms indicating that the individual continues using the substance despite significant substance-related problems. Well, that sounds a bit similar to my definition of addiction, doesn't it? They continue even though it's creating significant problems for them. All right. That brings us to our next polling question. Question is, what percentage of adult Americans will meet the diagnostic criteria for an alcohol use disorder at some point in their lives? All right, so I know those numbers keep on coming in, but it kind of looks like we're seeing a stabilizing pattern here where the majority of you were saying D, 24%. Second most popular option is E, 29%. And then finally, a minority are saying C, 16%, and no one has guessed 1 or 9%. Okay, so what's the answer to this question? Lifetime prevalence is 29.1% for alcohol use disorder. So those of you who said 29%, you had it right. 19.8% of those people, so we're talking about 20%, maybe 1 out of 5 people with an alcohol use disorder get treated for it. That is the scary and unfortunate part for us, for our clients, for our society. Now, if we look at the lifetime prevalence for some other type of substance use disorder, like cannabis use disorder or a stimulant use disorder, then that's roughly 10% lifetime prevalence, of whom about a quarter are treated. So basically 1 out of every 4 people who have an addiction to some substance besides alcohol are treated for it, which means the vast majority of people out there who meet diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder remain untreated. And that is the unfortunate and sad reality of the situation. 12-month prevalence. So what percentage of people will meet the criteria in within the past 12 months. That number is 13.9% for alcohol use disorders, of whom only 7.7% are treated in that year. And for other substance use disorders, about 4%, with about 13.5% of them actually being treated. So we have a lot of work to do, don't we, to make sure that treatment is readily available, accessible, and provided to the people who need it. All right, I'm going to check in on the chat box here real quick, make sure that you guys are okay, because I'm seeing some comments flowing in. And all right. So some people checked off all. Okay, so there are some people who are confused about how the chat box works. Now, when you send a chat message off, make sure there should be a little drop-down arrow next to to. And you want to click it and make sure that it says to all panelists and attendees, I believe. And that way, you know, everyone will see your comment. Now, if you're wanting to single somebody out, you can do that. But otherwise, that's the option you'll want to select. And Denise makes the comment, I'm sure that those numbers will increase with isolation for 2020. Oh, I have no doubt. And here's why, because we already have data that's saying that alcohol is selling in record quantities, and so is marijuana. Medical marijuana dramatically increasing as soon as social distancing started as a practice. And I have several clients who use medical marijuana, most of whom don't even know what they're using it for. Most of them are people who use marijuana recreationally prior to having medical marijuana in Florida, and they just kind of go through a quick screening process with someone they don't know very well, and then they have it, and they don't even necessarily remember what condition it's supposedly treating. But I do have some clients who are a little bit different in that pattern. But I think what we're seeing that, number one, people are afraid there will be a period of time where they do not have access to substances, so they're stockpiling substances. And number two, people are very stressed. Some people are bored, and people seek something that will quickly make them feel better. And alcohol and potentially addictive substances such as marijuana are great ways to do something and then feel something different very rapidly and very quickly. I would prefer my own philosophy to see that people find other ways of finding relief, of finding hope, and of finding their passion in lives, of having enjoyable experiences. But that is my opinion and my life philosophy, and not everybody shares that. So let's get back to the slides here. And oops, sorry, let me go back. So the drug and crime connection, just very quickly here. Drug users, of course, report greater involvement in crime, and they're more likely than non-users to have criminal records. People with criminal records are much more likely than others without records to report being drug users. Conversely, and crime rates increase proportionately with increases in drug use. So in other words, in any society, when we see an increase in potentially addictive drug use, we tend to see an increase in crime as well. And that's not just crime that's related to possession. That's crime that's related to things like domestic violence, burglaries, robberies and thefts, battery charges, etc. Next polling question. Court-ordered substance use treatment. Is it more, less, or equally effective as voluntary treatment? You can say A, it is more effective than voluntary treatment. B, it is less effective than voluntary treatment. Or you can say C, it is equally effective as voluntary treatment. Okay, looks like the numbers are stabilizing here. The majority of you are saying it is less effective, that court-ordered substance use treatment is less effective than voluntary treatment. Minority is saying it's equally effective or more effective than voluntary treatment. So what's the answer to this one? Surprise, surprise. Mandated treatment is just as effective as voluntary treatment. I did not believe that when I first heard that statistic. Now, I've heard that statistic many, many times over the years because many, many studies have looked into this. But the first time that I heard it was when I was working in a corrections program. I was like 23 years old in my first counselor job in a corrections program, long-term intensive residential substance abuse treatment, Florida Department of Corrections. And my supervisor said it's just as effective. And I did not believe it. I didn't believe it for one moment. But all these years later and all the research I've looked at, I do believe it. And all the experience that I've had, because I've done a lot of work with voluntary treatment. In fact, the vast majority of my work for many years has been voluntary treatment. I'm not seeing better success rates necessarily than I saw all those years doing mandated treatment. This is a difficult disorder to treat. And it also depends on how you define the word effective as well. But if you look at it from a standpoint of whether people are in remission or not, it really looks like it's just as effective. And we see this all the time. For the years that I did DUI groups, this is the pattern that we would see here in our own DUI program and the practice I work in now. Somebody comes in, they're very defensive, they're very angry, they do not want to be here. They think it is an injustice that has been exacted on them, that they now must go do treatment and pay money nonetheless for that treatment because of their DUI. They are not happy. They're really not happy when we talk to them about the requirements of the treatment, the length of the treatment, the urinalysis testing, etc. They're very defensive sometimes, very angry sometimes. But then an interesting thing starts to happen. They get into the group. Within a couple weeks, they kind of realize, these people actually do seem to care. Within a few weeks, they usually realize, the people who've been here longer kind of like it here. And it's kind of neat being able to talk to people and I feel heard and understood. Usually the anger and the defensiveness does not last very long. That therapeutic relationship starts to kick in. The positive influence of their peers who are further along in the process, the lower defenses of the people who have been here longer, it all starts to sink in. And what I tend to see is that they shift from one stage of change to another, which we will see later on. And quite honestly, for the voluntary treatment folks, most of them are still being coerced or pressured by somebody in some way, like a family member has been nagging at them to go get help, for example, or an employer has referred them or something along those lines. But even the ones who just woke up one morning and had an epiphany and said, I really need to get some help, even for them, change is very hard. And it is the norm rather than the exception to the norm to see that many people will be relapsing along the way, whether they're in mandated treatment or they're in voluntary treatment. Now, having said this, I would much prefer to work with people who are in voluntary treatment. I don't like working with when somebody, under the condition where somebody's coerced or pressured to see me. It's not my preference, but that does not mean that it isn't effective. So that's an important consideration. All right, now I'm going to pause for a moment on the slides just to check in with you folks who are in the chat, make sure that you're okay, because I am seeing some comments flying back and forth here. So there's a frustration with somebody trying to get into the texting. Is there an area code? No, you really just text it to that phone number. And I'm sorry that you're having difficulty and really wish you could participate, but feel free to chime in on the chat box on what your perspective is. And at least that way you can still interact with us. And then Emily has raised the issue. I think the argument could be made that they're equally as ineffective, not to be a bummer. Well, I guess glass half full, glass half empty. That is, I can't argue with what you're saying. You could argue they're equally ineffective and they're equally effective. Yeah. All right, so let's get back then to our slides. This is the interesting thing. I'm sure this will come as a surprise to you all, but the majority of clients who enter for substance use treatment are not exactly fully forthcoming with information and not fully honest about information. And that is because of an age-old psychological defense that we've known about since at least the late 1800s called denial. And the thing is, I don't as much like the stereotype that people with substance use disorders are liars. I don't prefer to think of it that way, because the interesting thing about denial is, and like, for example, in recovery rooms, you may hear that sometimes denial is conceptualized as an acronym for the phrase, don't even know I am lying. In other words, I personally like to think of lying as more intentionality. Am I intentionally sitting here thinking to myself, A is true, but I'm going to tell you that B is true because of C? The denial is oftentimes not connecting the dots. It is not seeing what others might be able to see as outsiders when they get glimpses of what's going on with a person. It is sometimes the lack of insight or awareness and not dishonesty. I agree that certainly it is hard to be an honest person when one is involved in an addictive process, but the very definition of addiction would suggest that you have to have some denial for the disorder to develop, because you would have to somehow be able to make it okay in your mind that the thing that you're doing that's causing all these problems is still the best thing for you to be doing somehow. And that is a very intricate um, and sort of challenging and complex defense that develops within people. And the truth is, you don't have to have a substance use disorder to have denial. We all have denial. We can all relate to that in different areas of our life. We all have these little pockets of blindness in our lives, including us as therapists. The thing that we cannot see that others seem to be able to see given the information that we have. And when you start to think of it that way, it's a very normal human phenomenon. But denial is a very difficult challenge for treating this particular type of disorder. It's very hard for many people to see what you might see as the outsider. There are so many threats to validity when you're doing substance abuse evaluations. One threat is positive impression management. What this really means is that the client is trying to portray themselves in a more positive light than the actual clinical picture would warrant. In other words, I'm trying to make myself look unusually good. You might see this happen, for example, if a client is involved in a child custody dispute and the other parent is alleging that they have a problem with substances, therefore they are not as stable and they need to be treated in order to have custody rights. Well, in that scenario, a parent will often be very much interested in portraying themselves in a very positive light. Positive impression management. But we also see negative impression management. This one might surprise you, but there are times when it's actually incentivized to exaggerate the problem. An example of that is when I worked in the Department of Corrections program, we would see clients that would get charged with things like, for example, trafficking. So they'll get charged because they're a drug dealer, and they'll get a felony charge, and they'll be sitting there in jail, and then they'll hear from somebody else who says, you know, if you tell them that you have a problem with addiction, you might be able to get into this residential program for a year and then avoid maybe 7 years in prison or something like that. So just tell them that you smoke crack every day and that you need help. And that might be able to get you into the treatment program. And then we had a subset of clients who would come in, and when they got into the program, they would say, yeah, I lied about all that. I've never used crack in my life, but I figured I'd rather go to a treatment program for a year than go to prison. And now that I'm here, I don't have to do the stuff that you guys want me to do because I don't even have this problem to begin with. So that's negative impression management. We're trying to exaggerate the problem. Neurocognitive impairments would be another barrier to validity, because there are clients who are going to have a hard time being able to process information and reason through things in a way that they could even tell you what's really going on. There are clients who are poor historians, for example, have very poor memory, or a difficult time analyzing information and making judgment calls. Finally, lack of insight, just generally and globally, just not being aware, not seeing what others might be able to see. So Lena has asked the question, at what point does denial become reality to the client? Well, I would say by definition, it seems like reality to them right up front, because denial is, they lack the awareness and the insight, and that is their subjective internal reality while they're experiencing it. Hopefully that makes some sense. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So this is a quote from Ackerman, who's one of the great forensic psychology gurus. Ackerman basically makes the point that very few evaluators in the profession of psychology are knowledgeable about substance abuse. There are lots of people out there doing evaluations who lack expertise in this area. I actually make an argument for our profession that this is one type of evaluation that in the forensic arena, it might be an advantage to have a counselor doing the evaluation over your average psychologist. Why do I say that? I say that because the majority of people working in substance use treatment in the United States are counselors, not psychologists. So they have a lot of experience with working with addictions, and they might be, therefore, very great evaluators when it comes to the forensic arena, but that's a soapbox. So why is quality evaluation so important? I think it's because, number one, there's an awful lot of stigma attached to having an addictive disorder, obviously. And it's a very difficult problem to have. It's one that is very resistant to change, and it's one that's very destructive, and it's one that has a lot of stigma attached to it. Major decisions may be made based on an evaluator's opinion. So clients deserve a thorough and objective evaluation. They deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And I really want the judicial system to take our profession seriously, because if we don't do quality evaluations and we do poor evaluations, then the judicial system loses its respect for our profession and the general public. And it's ultimately to the detriment not only of clients, but also to society at large. Here's what I mean by that. I've seen forensic substance abuse evaluations where you read the evaluation and all it is a biopsychosocial assessment. There's no diagnosis, nothing even substantiating a substance-related problem, and then suddenly you get to the end and they're recommending 20 weeks of outpatient treatment out of nowhere. There's no proof in the evaluation that the person even has a problem. Just a psychosocial where they're denying have a problem. So I would, if I were a judge, I would think it would be very hard to respect such an evaluation. Very easy to poke holes at it for opposing counsel also. Okay, so on that note, there is a problem in our field where we're unfortunately oftentimes merging two roles in together, and I don't think that's a very good thing most of the time. See, there are really two types of evaluations. There are forensic evaluations and there are clinical or therapeutic evaluations. Forensic evaluations, this is a scenario where there's an expert witness, somebody who's supposed to be objective. They are not there to help the client. They are there to answer as objectively as possible certain questions posed by a legal authority about an individual's substance use, treatment needs, etc. They're supposed to be extremely thorough and comprehensive, and they're not supposed to have a dog in this race. They are supposed to be objective. They are truth seekers and finders. They are not attached to the case. This is very different than clinical or therapeutic roles where our goal is to help our client and to advocate for them. It is unethical, if you look at our ethical codes, for us to try and play both roles. And in the legal arena, it's very easy for one attorney or the other to therefore have an individual discredited as a witness because they're trying to take both roles at the same time. If you are a therapist who is treating a client, then you are a fact witness. You can only attest to the facts of your treatment. You aren't there to provide objective, independent evaluations. You are biased by definition because your job is to help an individual. A forensic evaluator is a very different role. And I know that this gets breached all the time, and the government is actually complicit in it sometimes because it's not this way anymore, but even in my own county, years ago, there would be a contract that a treatment program could get with the drug court, where they become the people who do the evaluation to determine if someone should even be eligible for drug court. But then guess who has the grant to treat them? That same agency. So I would see evaluations like the one I described earlier, no evidence of a problem, and then suddenly they need treatment at the end. Who's to say that they don't just say everyone needs treatment because they want to get that extra grant money? That is an illustration of the problem with these roles overlapping. When you are conducting a forensic evaluation, if you're doing an evaluation that's court-ordered for the purpose of a judge or a jury making a determination on related to legal matters, then you want to reason more like a Vulcan. There's a subset of you who know what I'm talking about because you can secretly at least admit that you are Trekkies. But Vulcans focus on logic and reason. Klingons, on the other hand, are passionate and emotional, and they wear their heart on their sleeves, so to speak. When it comes to forensic evaluations, we have to reason more like a Vulcan. Look at our code of ethics. By the way, how many of you know that AMCA just published a brand spanking new code of ethics in 2020? AMCA does a great job of keeping their code updated. They update it about once every 5 years, which is a lot more frequently than the majority of associations. For example, ACA, oh, so that is my warning going off. That is my alarm that is saying that in less than 2 minutes, my Wi-Fi is going to freeze up for about 30 seconds, and then I will be awkwardly frozen on the screen, which means that this is time for us to have our first 5-minute break. Okay, so hopefully you can all see the slides again. We left off with the AMCA Code of Ethics, newly released in 2020, the forensic activity section. And so I'm just going to cover a few brief things here. If you're going to be doing evaluations for the courts that are substance abuse related evaluations, of course, you have to have appropriate knowledge and competence in the area that you're evaluating. You have to objectively offer your findings without bias or investment in the ultimate outcome, like we said earlier. You have to solicit appropriate informed consent from your client, and you have to base your recommendations on appropriate information and techniques. You don't offer any recommendations or conclusions on individuals who you haven't evaluated. And this one's important because there have been cases where counselors here in Florida and in other states have gotten into serious trouble. And the reason they got into serious trouble is that they'll do something like they'll be working with a client individually, say like they're working with a child maybe, and the child is involved in a custody case with mom and dad. Maybe mom's bringing the child to see the therapist. Dad is maybe suing for custody, for example. Therapist meets with mom and child say, Dad is a horrible guy and he's an alcoholic and child shouldn't be with dad at all. And the therapist worked with maybe child or even mother and child for a while, and then at some point gets asked to write a letter to the court saying, you know, in my opinion, it would be potentially traumatic for this child to be reunited with their father. So the therapist, believing that to be true, writes said letter and then gets in huge trouble. Why? Because that therapist didn't do a comprehensive evaluation. They've never even met dad. They don't know anything about dad's side of the story. They don't know anything about what's true and what's not true about what's being reported to them, but they're providing an opinion based on biased information, one side. They're not an objective evaluator. And so I can tell you about many cases where therapists got into huge trouble doing that sort of thing. So that, go back to our codes of ethics. You aren't going to be providing recommendations that involve other people who you've never evaluated. You avoid that. And you also accurately portray your qualifications in court. You tend to avoid evaluating any former clients or providing therapy for clients who you've previously forensically evaluated so that you keep those roles separate, showing that you're not biased based on financial considerations, for example. And you don't advocate for anyone or anything except for the truth. That's when you're doing forensic activity if you examine our codes. Also, our codes of ethics relate a lot to the issue about doing thorough evaluations to begin with. Mental health counselors base their diagnoses and other assessment summaries on multiple sources of data whenever possible. The client self-report is merely one source of data. It may be the most important one, but it's just one. What are your other sources of data? Are there objective tests that you administered? Have you done a records review? Have you interviewed other people? How else are you getting the information you need to provide recommendations, diagnoses, opinions, etc.? So on that note, Ackerman provides a pretty good recommendation for what would be the components of a quality evaluation. The first is the clinical interview. It is that interview that you have with a client in the room to get information from them, which again, in my opinion, is the most important source of data, but it's just one. But a second would be records that you review. That can include treatment records, like psychiatric treatment records and mental health records. It can even include biomedical records. I often will get records from a client's primary care physician, for example. And if a client is telling me, I've never had any medical problems connected to my drinking, but then when I get their records from their primary care physician, I see that they have had alcohol-related stomach ulcers and were advised to quit or cut back, but they haven't, or that their liver enzymes have been off, or something along those lines. And then that's information that contradicts their self-report, which I now must look into and learn more about. Previous evaluations. Some clients have already been evaluated in the past. So if they tell you, I've never had any problems in my relationships for my substance use, but they did an evaluation 3 years ago where they said, oh yeah, I've had a few breakups because of it, and that's additional information that you would need to factor into your evaluation. Arrest records and public records give you a lot of information. The officers often will put in their arrest reports specific evidence, like there was a distinct odor of marijuana and the individual's eyes were glossy and red. But maybe the client says, oh yeah, I've never had any legal problems connected to my marijuana use, for example. And then sometimes court records or even hearing transcripts could be helpful for those really in-depth forensic evaluations, but you get the idea about review of records, hopefully. A third data point is collateral information. These are interviews that you might conduct with other people in the client's life with appropriate consent, of course. People like a spouse or a partner, family members, an employer, a 12-step sponsor who can attest that they're active and engaged in their recovery, for example, and so forth. And then a final data point is objective test data. Here's what I mean by objective test data. Now, of course, no test is perfect. Also, no test can diagnose a human being. So please don't think I'm saying that. But there's a big difference between giving a Rorschach and giving a personality assessment inventory in terms of how reliable and valid the findings will tend to be in a forensic arena. So we'll talk about that later on. And drug testing, to me, is an absolute must when you're doing a substance abuse evaluation. The number of times I could tell you where I was doing a substance abuse eval, and then I disclose to the client that we will be conducting a urinalysis drug test. And then, oh, so there's something I need to tell you about. So there is that cocaine that I used recently that I didn't tell you about earlier. It's amazing how that changes things when you're doing urinalysis testing. So we'll get to that later on as well. These are the 4 components that we'll cover. Now, I get it. In the real world, you're not going to be able to do all 4 of these sometimes, especially in clinical or therapeutic environments. For my average private practice client, I'm not going to be doing all 4 of these things. But if I'm doing a forensic evaluation, something that's going to go to the courts, something that's going to have weight, something that's going to have a major impact on a client's life, well-being, a child, the public's safety, whatever the case might be, then I'm going to try and do my due diligence and hit all 4 of these data points. That brings us to the clinical interview. And the components of the clinical interview that I like to recommend are that we start with an informed consent. We move then into a discussion of the circumstances related to the referral. Then we get to our diagnostic interview, and we also review the biopsychosocial assessment to get the whole picture, to look at the whole person, and to appreciate context. And setting the stage, it's important to have a very clean and comfortable environment and to greet clients warmly, professionally, and comfortably. And just for me, I like to offer them water or a beverage, not an alcoholic one, of course. And that's in part not only respect, but some of my evaluations, depending on what kind of evaluation it is, can be very long, and the client needs to be comfortable. Also, they're going to have to do a urinalysis drug test. So the beverage kind of helps for them to be prepared for that. Going back to our code of ethics, CMHCs, clinical mental health counselors, inform clients involved in a forensic evaluation about the limits of confidentiality, the role of the counselor, and the purpose of the assessment. That is an important ethical and legal obligation, and this is just an example of an informed consent. I'm sitting a client down. I understand that you're here to see me today for a substance abuse evaluation that was ordered by the judge who's overseeing your child custody case. Before we get started, I'd like to explain a few things about our time here together and about my role in your case. First, I know that you read and signed some paperwork explaining confidentiality, but I also want to review the information with you verbally to make sure it makes sense to you. Whatever you tell me during this evaluation is confidential, which means that I can't tell anyone else what you tell me, but there are some exceptions. First, if you report to me that you're abusing or neglecting a child, so in other words, first we discuss the abuse and neglect exception, then the exception where there's an imminent risk of harm to self or others, and then we discuss the medical emergency exception, the signed court order from a judge exception, which, by the way, I have never gotten a signed court order from a judge in my entire career, but lots of subpoenas. That's a different story. And then also, if the client signs a release of information that gives you consent to provide information to somebody else, then certainly confidential information can be shared. I tell them that's an important exception because if you're going to comply with the order from the judge, then you'll need to sign a release form allowing me to release my evaluation records to the court. That information will then become a part of your case, and it could play a significant role in the outcome of your case. Now, let me pause here for a moment and explain something. Sometimes I'll even tell people, although I am a licensed mental health counselor, I am not your counselor. I'm here as an evaluator today. So my role is not to help you accomplish your goals like I would with a therapy client. My goal is to answer certain questions, or my role is to answer certain questions that have been posed to me by the referral source. So just helping them to understand that is a very ethical thing to do as well. So do you understand what I've described about confidentiality? Do you have any questions? With that information in mind, would you like to go forward with this evaluation? Kind of like the Miranda rights, where at the end a police officer might say, with these rights in mind, do you wish to speak to us now? Then I go in and I explain the evaluation, what it consists of. I tell them, first I'm going to ask you questions about your substance use history throughout your life, including what you've used, how much, how often you've used, when you use, and some of the circumstances surrounding your use. Then I'll be asking you some questions about things that you may or may not have experienced because of your substance use. If you participate in any kind of mental health, substance use, or medical treatments that might be relevant to the questions I'm answering for your evaluation, then I'll probably ask you about those experiences. Then I'll be asking you some follow-up questions about the questionnaires and the tests that you completed. Also, we'll be taking a urine sample from you today that we'll send to a lab to test for substances that you might have recently used. We'll use those results to help support what you tell me today about your recent alcohol or drug use. For example, if you tell me that you recently drank alcohol, but that you never used cocaine, then we might expect to see a positive result for alcohol, but not a negative result for cocaine. It's very important that you do your best to tell me the truth about your substance use. And then I explain the way that we collect the urine specimen, how it's processed, and those sorts of things. I do not tell clients about the urine test until they are here. That is important because if you tell a client ahead of time, prior to the evaluation, then the probability that they will attempt to adulterate the specimen or prolong the evaluation to wait until the urine results show something different than what the clinical picture would warrant starts to increase. Clients may start to use their over-the-counter detox pills, go to a smoke shop and get something or whatever the case might be. They might try to bring in somebody else's urine. I'm not going to go into great detail about how to compensate for some of those measures, but if we get to it later on, you guys are interested, then we'll talk about it some more. But the bottom line is that I surprise them with the urine test when they come into the office, but it's part of the informed consent process before we even get into the evaluation. I also explain to them that I'll be checking public records to see if records match up to what they tell me about their legal history, such as arrests and lawsuits. Also, I may be identifying people to interview about their experiences with you. This may include family members, significant others, treatment professionals, or physicians you've worked with, your attorney or your employer. I would talk with you first before interviewing anyone, explaining that what I will be asking them and why, and I would also ask for you to sign a consent form giving me permission to talk to them first. So then, do you understand what I've described and how this evaluation works? Do you have any questions? And with this information in mind, would you like to go forward with the evaluation? So that, I think, is a great example of the first two components of the informed consent. And then finally, I tell them, earlier I mentioned I'll be checking public records to see if the records match up with what you tell me about your history of arrest and involvement in lawsuits. Do you think anything will show up about in those records that you haven't already told us about? At some point in the interview, I raise this question. I also, at some point in the interview, will say, earlier I mentioned that I'll be collecting a urine specimen for a drug test. Do you think that anything will show up in that test that you haven't already told me about? The reason I ask these kinds of questions is to give the client the opportunity to sort of save face and just cut to the chase and just tell me the truth about what's going on, because that's what I'm seeking, is the truth. Now, maybe we could start with you telling me some more information about what happened leading up to this evaluation and why the judge ordered it. So that's my introduction into us beginning to explore, why are we here for this evaluation? What's going on exactly? Now, this is an example of what I do for an informed consent. It doesn't mean it's what you should do. It's your responsibility ultimately to ensure that you have a good informed consent process and that it's reflective of whatever laws that you are beholden to in your role and your jurisdiction. All right, now I do see, I'm going to pause here for just a moment because we have a couple Q&As here. What is your text address again to answer the poll? Okay. All right, these are questions it looks like that came quite a ways back. So I am going to, when we get to the next polling question, I will again remind you all how to participate in the polling question, and I'll try to do it more slowly this time. All right, so circumstances related to the referral. I'm interested in who, what, where, when, and how we got to this point where we're doing this evaluation. We're going to use our active listening skills. That's what we're good at as counselors, right? We want to get them to tell their story and to tell it freely. Hold on just a moment. Let me give myself a little water here. We want them to be able to tell their story freely to us. We want them to provide more information, not less. Now, I know in the real world, and especially in clinical and therapeutic environments, that's not going to be an option sometimes because you have limitations on the time that you can spend with somebody. But in the ideal world, we want them to really be able to spend time getting their story out. When you think you have that story, read your notes back to the client. Ask him or her if it sounds right. When I take their substance use history, I always read it back to them and see if they agree that it sounds accurate to them. Ensure that you have verified the exact verbiage of what the referral source is looking for. So this happens all the time. Somebody calls up and says, I don't know, like my probation officer said I'm supposed to do this thing with you guys, or yeah, I'm supposed to do some kind of like an alcohol test or something. People sometimes don't even know what it is that we're supposed to do with them. So we need to verify it. And the way I do that is I ask them to provide me any paperwork that they have from whoever referred them for the evaluation. So I can look at it and see if I'm the right person to do it and see if it's clear to me what exactly the referral source is looking for. And of course, have them sign a release form so I can contact the referral source directly to clarify and verify what those questions are that I'm being tasked. Because sometimes people just do the evaluation based on what the client says, but they haven't verified it. Then they get disqualified as an expert because they didn't even answer the right questions. They're over here talking about somebody being a good candidate for drug court when actually the question posed was whether or not the individual was under the influence of a substance in all likelihood at the time that an offense allegedly occurred or something else. That's a great way to get a very bad reputation in the field and to get disqualified, is to not have verified the referral questions. So let's get into the diagnostic interview next. First of all, and in a few moments, we're going to have an interactive exercise and a polling question for those of you who are getting bored of me blabbing on. But before we do that, I'm just going to cut it down to some bare bone categories. Some of you know about a textbook that's often used in both undergraduate and graduate courses called uppers, downers, all-arounders. It sort of simplifies drugs of use and by categorizing them into three different areas. Uppers are stimulants like amphetamines, cocaine, and tobacco, or caffeine for that matter. They are things that speed things up, that give us energy or accelerate action in some way, that increase heart rate, those sorts of things. Downers are depressants, essentially. Central nervous system depressants. They slow things down. They make us move more slowly. Sometimes they get us tired and tapped out. Sometimes they have people walking funny, or they have people having slurred speech. They slow things down in the grand scheme of things. They include alcohol, opioids like heroin, or painkillers like hydrocodone, oxycodone, etc. And sedatives, hypnotics, and anxiolytics like benzodiazepines like Xanax or alprazolam, or Klonopin, which is clonazepam, and barbiturates, which are a lot less frequently used these days. Then there are the all-arounders. Marijuana is an all-arounder. It's an all-arounder because it is a stimulant in the sense that it initially increases heart rate. It is a depressant because it slows down and impairs motor coordination and functioning, and it also tends to reduce energy rather than accelerate energy. And it tends to calm or soothe rather than excite or invigorate. But it's also a hallucinogen because it creates distortions in perception of time and space. For example, an undercover police officer who I trained with one time, when he was undercover and doing drug deals, he would sometimes have to use a substance to not blow his cover. So on one deal, he used marijuana with somebody, and then he gets into a car and he starts driving away. He notices a red light up ahead. Dutifully, he stops. After sitting for what seemed like an eternity because of the distortion in perception of space or time, he realizes that the red light is way over there and his car is way over here. That's an illustration of the distortion in perception of space. Usually when it comes to driving in marijuana, we'll tend to see that people are making slow, careless mistakes rather than fast, careless mistakes. Anyway, hallucinogens are also all-arounders like PCP, LSD, shrooms, mescaline, or cactus, basically, that's hallucinogenic. Inhalants, like whippets, for example, nitrous oxide. And then there are other substances like synthetic marijuana. Kratom is a good example as well. Kratom, FDA classifies it as an opioid, which is a downer, but it has some other traits and qualities that fit into the upper category as well, making it an all-arounder in my opinion. So when you think about it in these three categories, suddenly it gets a little easier to differentiate the substances and the effects of these substances, what they do to people, such that you can observe a client in the room who's under the influence of a substance and maybe have a ballpark idea about what they might have used. We'll do an interactive exercise to that effect. We're going to look at David after the dentist.
Okay, so we won't be able to show you this video that we showed the live audience because it'll probably violate some kind of copyright rule. But if you pause this video and then you open up another window, you can go to YouTube and you can type David after the dentist and you can watch that video, then come back to this video, hit play, and continue along. Again, that video that you're looking for is called David after the dentist.
All right, and that is our case example of David after the dentist. So the question I have for you all, which category of substances did David likely use? You can say A, uppers, B, downers, or C, all-arounders. The numbers are pretty well stabilized here, with about 3/4 of you or so saying all-arounders, and then about maybe, well, now about 32% of you saying downers. So I could see how a lot of you would say all-arounders because, I mean, he's also having these little moments where he's kind of yelling and things like that. But really, when you look at it, overall, things are slowed down. His movements are kind of slower. His speaking, for the most part, is kind of slow. It's really more a downer, a depressant in this case. He probably took an opiate because he just had dental surgery, and so there's probably pain. They probably wouldn't have given him a stimulant of some kind in order to treat that pain. They probably would have done an opiate of some kind, probably something like a Vicodin, something along those lines. And because it's presumably maybe his first time having taken such a medication, he knows that something feels different, and maybe it's a little bit scary in some ways to him also, and a little bit confusing. All right, so let's move on to obtaining a substance use history from your client. So at this point, you would explain to the client that you know that he or she's not going to be able to be a perfect historian and that you're seeking estimates and approximations. For each category of substances, you're going to ask what was used, how it was used, how much was used, and what the client liked or disliked about their use, and also when it was used, because you need those 5 things in order to diagnose. They all are required as part of the DSM diagnostic process for a substance use disorder. Now, the way we do it is we have them complete a very thorough questionnaire before we even meet with them one-on-one. And that questionnaire includes their substance use history. We have all the categories of substances. We ask them at what age they first used it, when they most recently used it, how much they've used it over the past year, if they have over the past year, and what circumstances they use it in. And sometimes clients fill all that out, and sometimes they put nothing in there or very little in there, but at least it gives us our starting point. And then in the interview, we go into greater detail. I will usually find that mandated clients are bare bones when they enter that information in. They don't tell you much. You have to really pry to get more a lot of times. So what was used, how often, how much, what the client liked or disliked about it, because that gives me a window as to why are they using it and what are the drawbacks of using it, and then when was it used. Because if it was 10 years ago, that's going to have a difference in what the diagnosis might look like versus it being yesterday. Now, we're going to go into the DSM criteria in a moment, but pay attention to verbiage. Words and phrases like clinically significant, recurrent, markedly, continued, often, persistent, and great deal make it clear that scattered, isolated, and minor manifestations do not meet the diagnostic threshold. Pay close attention to those words. You can't say that because something happened one time, but the criterion says it has to be recurrent or often, that the criterion is met. So we have to pay close attention to the verbiage when we're diagnosing. With each symptom that's diagnosed, find out when the symptom was happening, how often it was happening, and for what substances, because again, you will need that to formulate your diagnosis. You'll see that in a few minutes. Also, dig deeper. If the client answers yes to any symptom-related question, ask follow-up questions like, well, when's the most recent time you think that was happening? Or how often do you think that used to happen? Let them tell their story. Use active listening skills. Ask lots of questions. Dig deeper, and you'll get more information usually. Let's look at the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5 for substance use disorders. It begins by telling us that we have to have a pattern of substance use, leading to clinically significant impairment or distress as manifested by at least 2 of the following in the same 12-month period. So keywords here, I should have bolded pattern, even though I didn't, because pattern tells you, again, not an isolated incident. Pattern, it repeatedly bears out this way. How do we define significant impairment or distress? We say that we're going to define it by at least 2 of a list of 11 things happening in the same 12-month period. The first symptom of those 11 is that the substance is often taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than was intended. Here are examples of questions I ask, because if you or in the clinical interview, if you ask your average client, so have you often taken larger amounts of this substance over a longer period than was intended? Most clients are going to stare at you blankly or say no, or I don't think so, or whatever the case might be. Because it's medicalese. It's written like a psychiatrist would write something because that's who wrote the DSM. If you ask them normally worded questions, the way that people normally talk, you get different answers. For example, was there ever a period of time in your life when you were often using one of these substances more than you planned on? That's more casually worded, easier to understand. Have you ever thought to yourself something like, I'm just going to spend 2 hours tops at the bar today, but then you found yourself staying a lot longer? Have you ever thought to yourself, I'm just going to have 2 this time, but found yourself drinking more than that? And if they say yes, then I'm going to ask them, well, about how often? Was that something that would happen once in a while, something that would happen frequently? Let's say they say frequently. Well, how often is frequently? Or how often is once in a while? Do you think it would happen once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week? So you have to use normal wording, not just read off the DSM-5 or something like that. The second criterion is a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control the use of the substance. And again, if you ask a client, so you had a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control the use of the substance, they're going to stare at you blankly or say no. But if you ask them questions like, hey, have you ever quit? When did you quit? Do you know why you wanted to quit? Did you go back to using? What do you think happened if you did? Did you ever try to scale back on your use? What was that like? How did it go? When was it happening? Why do you think you wanted to scale back? These are normally worded questions that will help you decide if that criterion is met. Third symptom, a great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain the substance, use the substance, or recover from its effects. Okay, again, you can't word it that way for your average client. You would want to ask them words that are easily, and wording that is easily understood. Do you think there was a period of time in your life in which using alcohol seemed to be taking up an awful lot of your time? By a lot of your time, I mean a few hours or a day or more when you combine getting it, using it, and recovering from it, like nursing a nasty hangover, for example. These are more casually worded ways to get to whether this criterion is met. The next symptom is craving, a strong desire or urge to use the substance. An example of a question, have you ever had an urge, craving, or strong desire to use marijuana? Have you ever really wanted to use it really, really badly? And do you notice that if you don't use it for a while, that you get strong desires, almost like you're being compelled to use it, although compelled is probably not a good word to use, but then the next symptom is recurring substance use resulting in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. You can't ask them if their use has resulted in failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home, because then they stare at you blankly or say no. So you ask things like, hey, do you think there was ever a period of time in your life when using one of these substances seemed to be getting in the way of some important responsibilities? They could be at work, home, or school, for example. And then let's say they say no, because they often do. Then I say, all right, well, let me just give you some examples to help be thorough, though. Have you ever skipped school to get high? Have you ever gone home after school, smoked some weed, and then you didn't feel like doing your homework or studying? When all this was happening, what were your grades like? You're trying to figure out, is there a connection between their marijuana use and their school performance, for example? Back when you were drinking a lot, did you notice that you didn't keep your house as clean as usual? Have you ever called in sick because of a hangover? Have you ever gone to work when you had a hangover, but you were less productive than usual? Did that ever get you into any trouble? Do you think it ever affected your performance review, for example? Those kinds of questions. Another common one here is asking people, back when you were smoking marijuana every day, did you tend to, when you were smoking marijuana every day, did you tend to, and you were also trying to get a job, would you tend to avoid jobs that had a drug test, even though you really needed one? And that would be an example also. The next symptom is a strong craving, desire, or I'm sorry, we already went through that one just now. Sorry, I got distracted. Next slide. Continued use despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems caused or exacerbated by the effects of the substance. For this one, you might ask questions like, do you think that using any of these substances has ever caused any problems with your relationships with family, friends, or significant others? Even if they say no, I still usually say, okay, I'd just like to give you some examples though, just to be thorough. And then I might ask things like, or I might say things like, have you ever been drinking and said something mean or nasty that you probably wouldn't have said had you not been drinking? Have you ever been drinking and gotten into a fight that you probably wouldn't have gotten into had you not been drinking? Have you had a significant other ever argue with you about how much you use or how much money you spend or anything else about your use? Has a significant other or a family member ever said that they were concerned or unhappy about your use? And if you go back and you look at some of the questionnaires they've completed and things, you might actually have some evidence that that could have happened, that you might share with them and then ask them for some more information about it. Next symptom is important social, occupational, or recreational activities given up or reduced because of using the substances. Some examples of questions. Do you think that there are any important activities that you stopped doing? I don't know. I think that's a typo. Stopped doing so much. And you think that maybe your drinking or use had something to do with it? And then regardless of how they answer, I'll probably say, do you mind if I give you some examples that some other clients have talked to me about? And I give them real examples. A guy told me that he used to run almost every day, but then he started smoking cigarettes and he stopped running. He noticed that when he quit smoking, he started running again, but when he went back to smoking, he stopped running. He thinks the two are connected somehow. Another example, a guy told me that he quit playing soccer and football in high school because he knew he couldn't pass a drug test. Another one, a lady once told me that she went to yoga every Sunday. She said, some people go to church on Sundays, I go to yoga. But she started going out on Saturday nights and drinking a lot. And then she stopped getting up on Sunday mornings for yoga. The next symptom, which by the way, is one of the most commonly met symptoms in the United States for a substance use disorder. Recurrent substance use in situations in which it is physically hazardous. Examples of questions. Have you ever driven when you could feel high or buzzed? Or when do you think, the way I word it, especially if I can already see they've had DUI arrests or that sort of thing, I would say, when do you think was the last time that you drove when you could feel high or buzzed? Do you think you've ever driven after you've been drinking, and if you happen to get pulled over by a cop and did a breathalyzer, you'd probably have blown high enough to get a DUI? Have you ever gone hunting when you were drinking? Boating, bungee jumping? Have you ever done any work around the house when you were drinking, like roofing or using a machine of some kind? So I'm trying to find out, is it a machine that it could be very dangerous if you're impaired when you're using it, basically. The next symptom, the substance use is continued despite knowledge of having a persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problem likely to have been caused or exacerbated by the use of the substance. Imagine asking a client that in those words. That would be a difficult question for them to answer, but instead, you might go into their record and see, did they report any medical issues or prescriptions? You might say, I see here that you are getting some medication because of high blood pressure and high cholesterol. I'm wondering, has your doctor ever suggested to you that you cut back on your drinking to help lower your blood pressure or your cholesterol level? Or you might notice prescriptions that they're taking that interact negatively with alcohol, and you might ask them, has a doctor ever told you that it'd be best to avoid drinking when you're using this medication? Or do you know what the label says on that medication about combining it with alcohol? You'd be surprised how often they'll tell you, oh yeah, it says to not mix them. And they've been mixing them. You might ask some questions like, what do you think causes your stomach ulcers? See if they say, oh, well, probably my drinking. Did your doctor ever say that drinking could have an effect on? Has a doctor ever suggested to you that you cut back on? Do you know about any physical problems that might be affected by using this substance? Sometimes people notice that when they use cocaine, they feel anxious, depressed, or paranoid. Has that ever happened to you? So these are lead-in questions to get a closer picture to help you decide whether this symptom might have been met. The next one is tolerance. Tolerance is either that the client needs more over time to get the same effect because they've been using it so frequently that their system is habituating to it, or they get a lot less effect even though they're using the same amount as always. Note that if the client has never used a substance daily or nearly daily for several days or longer, then there's probably no need to ask about this symptom or the next one, which is withdrawal. But here are questions. Have you noticed that when you drink now, you get less of a buzz than you used to? Now, let me qualify this question and say it's not a fair comparison if they're comparing when they were 15 years old and weighed 145 pounds and were very, very skinny to when they're 45 and they weigh 270 pounds. It's not necessarily a fair comparison in that case, but you'd still ask and then you would narrow in on the details from there. Have you noticed that it takes more beers to get the same feeling you used to get from less? Now, sometimes the client reports the opposite. Actually, now I'm getting more of an effect from less, and that can actually be a bad sign. But that's another thing to talk about later. Withdrawal. So if they're using the substance daily or almost daily, and their system's habituating to it, the question is when they stop or they cut back, do things go kind of haywire in their body or mind for a while as their body or mind tries to readjust? When you were using blank frequently and you stopped or quit back, did you notice anything weird happening with your body or your mind, like your system was trying to adjust or change somehow? Ask questions about the specific withdrawal symptoms in the DSM-5. So in the DSM-5, each category of substances has a specific list of withdrawal symptoms. For example, cannabis withdrawal, one of the common symptoms is sleep disturbance, increases in anxiety, irritability, or depressed mood. And also reductions in appetite. Those are some of the common withdrawal symptoms for cannabis. But that'll be different than the withdrawal symptoms for amphetamine, for example. Consider talking about tobacco or nicotine first, maybe even caffeine, because I find that if you start with the drugs that have less stigma attached to them, clients open up more. And once they've started opening up more, when you get to the substances that are more stigmatized, they've already disclosed a great deal, and that pattern may continue. So here's our next trivia question. Withdrawal and tolerance do not count as symptoms of a substance use disorder if the client's taking legally prescribed medication. You can say A for true or B for false. Is it true that you can't count withdrawal and tolerance if the medication was being legally prescribed by a doctor? And in case there's anybody while these responses are coming in who has not yet set up for the polling questions, remember, like it says at the top of the screen there, you can text Aaron Norton 175 to the phone number 37607 to join. Aaron Norton 175 to the phone number 37607. And the numbers are kind of stabilizing. It's pretty clear that the majority of you are saying false and a minority are saying true. Surprisingly, with a slight exception, the answer is kind of true here. I know it's shocking, but it literally says in the DSM that tolerance and withdrawal cannot be counted as symptoms if the client is using any of these three categories of medications: a sedative, hypnotic, or anxiolytic, like Xanax, for example, an opioid, like hydrocodone, for example, or a stimulant medication, like Adderall, as prescribed, consistent with physician's orders. In other words, if a doctor says, I'm prescribing Klonopin for you, and you are taking it as prescribed, it literally says in the DSM, you can't count tolerance and withdrawal in your number count of symptoms. Sounds weird, but here's the reason why. The reason why is because anybody who takes any potentially addictive substance regularly is bound to experience tolerance and withdrawal. Doesn't matter. Could be medical marijuana, could be Adderall, could be Xanax, but it's normal for that to happen under that context. They sort of presume, falsely in my opinion, that if a physician is legally prescribing the medication and the client is taking it as prescribed, meaning, for example, they're not taking it in driving, they're taking no more than what they're allowed to take under the doctor's orders, etc., then the doctor has concluded that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks for taking this medication. So we're not going to count these two symptoms towards our number count of symptoms. I know it's controversial. It just is what it is. It's in there in the DSM. Now, I kind of know this is controversial because every time I ever bring it up, people start entering things into the chat box. So let's see what we have here. I answered on the text and got the message, Aaron has not opened the poll yet. Try later. Okay. I'm sorry to hear that, Christine. It's possible that there might be a bad reception or something in your area or something along those lines. So you can continue entering your responses in the chat box. And I'm sorry that the texting isn't working for you. Looks like it's working for the majority of folks, though. So I apologize for those who can't access it. Now, I'm going to bring the diagnosis part down to 5 steps, really. The first one is to determine what symptoms have been met for what substances and when. The second step is to diagnose the substance use disorder for any substance that has 2 or more symptoms in the same 12-month period. So if the person, out of those 11 symptoms, they've said yes to 2 of them in the same 12-month period, then you already know you're going to diagnose an alcohol use disorder. But now you're not done. You now have to decide, is it in remission? Then you have to decide if the client's in a controlled environment. And then lastly, you have to decide what the severity of their symptoms is. How do you do these 5 things? I'm going to walk you through that. Let's go with the first one, specifying severity. If the client has acknowledged 2 to 3 symptoms in the same 12-month period, that is a mild severity. If 4 or 5 symptoms, that is moderate. And if 6 or more symptoms, that is severe. Now, there is controversy about this model. I don't have a solution to the controversy. I only know about the problem. The problem is people will look at a case and say, well, here's one client who's got 4 or 5 symptoms, but they're not really that big of a deal. This other client only has 2 symptoms, but they're a huge deal. This person seems more severe than this person, but the number count suggests mild. Well, that does happen sometimes. I mean, in theory, if one of the symptoms was you almost died, then that one symptom would look an awful lot more important than you spent a little less time studying for a class in 5th grade or something like that. So it's a valid point. I just don't have a good solution for it, except that you can exercise clinical judgment. And there might be a case where it looks mild by number count, but it's so big of a deal that you might still call it moderate, for example. And the question is, can you justify that? Can you articulate a logical, reasonable explanation for it? But generally, we go by a number count. We go by quantity of symptoms. And that's the way it's spelled out in the DSM. This one is next. Our next polling question. In the DSM-5, remission is determined by how long the client has maintained abstinence or sobriety. True or false? Meaning, do we decide whether they're in remission based on whether they're still using or not? Is that the gauge that we use to determine whether somebody's in remission? You can say A for true, or you can say B for false. All right, the numbers are stabilizing here, so I think it's safe to say the vast majority say true and a minority say false. The reason why I asked this question is it's a common myth. Technically, the DSM doesn't make a judgment call for remission based on whether the client's still using or not. It's more, are they experiencing any of those 11 symptoms? Theoretically, they could still be using, but not be experiencing any of those 11 symptoms, and therefore be in remission. It's highly unlikely that that will happen, Very rare in real practice, but technically that's how they define remission, not by whether you're using or not. For example, somebody could have a mild alcohol use disorder, which we used to call alcohol abuse in the DSM-4. They could meet with a counselor, work on responsible drinking strategies, continue to drink alcohol, but no longer have any problems from it, and they would be considered in remission. Early remission is defined as at least 3 months, but less than 12 months of none of those 11 symptoms happening, except one exception, craving. They can still be craving and be in remission. Sustained remission is if none of those 11 symptoms have been present for 12 months or longer, except again, possibly craving. So that's how we define remission technically. Another specifier that you can tack on to the end of a diagnosis is in a controlled environment. If a disorder is in remission and the individual is in an environment where access to the substance is restricted, you would tack on in a controlled environment at the end of your diagnosis. Example, they're in jail or prison. Yes, you can still use in jail or prison, I know that, but for most people, it's less accessible there and easier, therefore, to not use than in other settings in the community. Halfway houses and transitional houses, the same. Of course, you can still access it. You're just less likely to because you're in a controlled environment. Same thing with residential treatment programs and hospitals. Then there's another specifier that you can add to the end of a diagnosis if the client has met the criteria for an opioid use disorder, but they're taking a prescribed agonist medication like methadone or buprenorphine. And none of the criteria for an opioid use disorder has been met for that class of medication except tolerance and withdrawal. Then you tack on at the end of your diagnosis on maintenance therapy at the end if they're in remission. Now I'm going to show you there's a tool called the Substance Use Disorder Assessment Tool. It is in the handouts folder, which again I put into the chat box. If you scroll back towards the beginning of today's webinar, you'll see it there. So it's in that folder, and I'm also going to use it for a case example here. So we're going to do an interactive exercise, and we're going to do a case study and see if we can come up with a diagnosis. Before we do that, let me just check our chat box and see if anybody has anything that we need to attend to. Oh, David said also an alcohol monitor. Okay, that's unique. I've never thought of that before, David. I think he's making the case that you could add the specifier in a controlled environment if a client is, for example, has a scram device on their ankle, which is monitoring them for alcohol use at all times, like some clients are court ordered to do. That's a good point. All right. So let's do our diagnostic exercise. We're going to watch a very brief video clip. We are going to then look for yellow flags, things that tell us that maybe a DSM-5 symptom is met. At the end of the video, we're going to go down the diagnostic criteria line by line, and then we are going to see if we can identify those yellow flags. So some people are saying that the folder is not there. If you scroll up, you will find it. It was at 1:35 p.m., but I will also paste it again into the box here so that you have it at the bottom of your feed as well in the chat box. There it is.
All right, this is another video that we showed the live audience, but that we probably can't show you in this YouTube video because it's copyrighted material. So instead, go pause this video, go to your browser, open a new page, visit vh1.com, and use the search box to search for Celebrity Rehab Season 1. Then click on Episodes and choose the intake episode, which is Episode 1. Watch from about 28 minutes through 30 minutes and 56 seconds. Then come back to this video and proceed to the next clip. You'll be watching a brief segment on Jamie Foxworth.
Okay, so hopefully you can right now see my iPad on the screen, and I'm going to pull up the substance use disorder checklist for a moment here. So when I'm doing a clinical interview with a client, I'm kind of going down the symptoms and I'm asking questions because by now I kind of have in my head the questions without having to look at them or anything to help me figure out whether that criterion has been met. And then I'm coding certain things as we go through here. Let's start with the first one. The substance use is often taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than was intended. We could ask ourselves the question, any evidence that this particular individual, any yellow flag that says that maybe this symptom has been met for her? Anybody want to type that into the chat box? Did you hear anything? Or I know it's a short video, hard to remember what was happening in it, but was there anything that you saw or that was said that would suggest that she is often smoking more marijuana or for a longer period than was intended? And seeing no entries in the chat box yet, I am going to just tell you what I think. Oh, yes, somebody has responded. So a friend commented, yes, they did. This is ridiculous. We just smoked 12 blunts and now you want another one and we're still just about to go. 8 blunts a day. She said she smokes about an eighth a day, which is a pretty good amount. Peers notice more use than the norm. She smokes every day, every hour. Okay, so those are all yellow flags. There are things that say maybe this criterion has been met. I get the impression from that cutscene that she's saying one more and then we'll go. Oh, one more and then we'll go. Oh, one more and then we'll go. I don't know if the plan was come to my place, we'll smoke 13 blunts and then maybe we'll go, or if it was just, we'll have a couple or something like that. So it's a yellow flag on the field. So I'm going to put that down as a possibility. And then if I was doing an evaluation, I would write, THC right here, and then I would put when, well, let's say that was a week ago. The most recent time was about 1 week ago. And then I move on to the next one. There's a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control use of the substance. So is there any evidence that she's been trying to quit or trying to scale back but not being successful in doing so? Now, key things here, persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts. Doesn't have to be both, could be one or the other. Either she's had a persistent desire but has done nothing about it, or she's had unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control it. And since I don't see any comments yet answering that one, here we go. I want to get so high that I don't even want to smoke when I get there. Okay. Yeah, she said my goal is to get so high that I don't even want to go anymore or something like that. Not until she went to treatment. So David pointed out something good. She is going to treatment. That would imply that there's been a desire, but maybe not. Maybe she was court ordered, or maybe they offered a whole bunch of money for her to go on this show, and that's why she's doing it. But it would be an opening to ask and find out some more about that. There is something that she did say that to me implies it's a yellow flag that says we might have a persistent desire. She said, I feel like I'm addicted to it. So I would ask her, can you help me to understand? You said that you feel like you're addicted to it. What tells you that? If she starts telling me about, oh yeah, I know I smoke too much, and I know I can't just use it forever, or I know I need to cut back, and then I'm starting to find out about that voice within her that says something is wrong here, something is not right, I really ought to change something. And that may end up being enough for me to say that there's a persistent desire. It depends. We'd have to find out. So this one's really just a who knows for right now. And then a great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain the substance, use it, or recover from its effects. What do you think? Is it absorbing a great deal of her time? Lots of yeps, 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 and yeses. Yes, all day, 10 years. Yeah. Okay, this one's kind of a no-brainer for me because she says every day, every hour, about 10 years. So that's a great deal of time. So yes, I'm going to say THC and I'm going to say current. Right now it's that way. The next one is craving, a strong desire or urge to use it. Does anything in that clip imply that there are strong cravings for marijuana? And if so, did you catch it, or what was it maybe? All right, no responses to that one yet. I mean, clearly she's seeking out the substance. She's using it very frequently, but she didn't really say anything in that clip that I caught anyway that would tell us that she's directly saying, I have strong desires and urges, or I feel compelled to, or something. Probably does, but just can't tell from that clip, in my opinion. So the next one is recurrent use resulting in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. Is it interfering with her obligations and responsibilities in life? Any evidence of that? Yes, 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 people are saying. She directly said, when I smoke, I get lazy. I don't want to do anything. If I can't get high, I don't want to do anything. If I do get high, I don't do anything anyway. So it's delayed a lot of things for a long time now, she said. She said, I don't want to go on auditions. I get lazy. She's clearly saying that it is interfering. Like she's talking about financial problems and feeling desperate with money towards the beginning of the clip. She won't go out on auditions because she's getting high instead. To me, this one is pretty clearly cut. Although, of course, we'd never diagnose somebody based on a few minutes of interview. Then the next one is recurrent social or interpersonal problems. Is it interfering with relationships? Is it making it harder to get along with people? Any evidence of that? I'm going to cut to the chase on this one and say the only thing that I see in that clip, and you guys are pointing it out right now, mom. Mom says the other day her lungs were so bad that she couldn't breathe. And that's just her body's way of saying, you're going to kill me. And I don't want to bury my daughter a year from now. I don't want to see that. All right. So mom is clearly very concerned. That's a yellow flag on the field. I would be asking more about that. Mom is obviously very, very concerned. What other people in her life are concerned? What have their relationships been like? How does this pan out? Is this interfering with the quality of her relationships? Somebody said boyfriend. There is a boy in the clip who is saying this is ridiculous. We just smoked 12 blunts. You still want to have another one. We're still about to go. Yeah, you can see that's a yellow flag that maybe some of her friends are annoyed or irritated by this also to some extent. That would make sense to me as well. All right, next symptom. Important social, occupational, or recreational activities given up or reduced. We already kind of pointed that one out. That one's pretty clear. Occupational activities, at the very least, are reduced. Number 8, recurrent use in physically hazardous situations. What do you guys think? I only see one point in that clip where there was a physically, now somebody said lung. I'm glad you bring this up because for me, that is not the intent of this criteria. Number 8, that is the intent of number 9, a physical problem likely to have been caused or exacerbated by the use of the substance. So 8 is more in the here and now. Right now is something dangerous going to happen because I'm doing it. Not maybe one day I will get bronchitis or something, but it's right now, and it's not like a medical condition kind of thing. That's symptom number 9. So somebody said porn, possibly. I mean, if she was saying I'm engaging in unprotected sex while under the influence of a substance, and I don't think I would otherwise do that, then maybe. So possibly, but we don't know for sure just because she's doing porn. And then the most common way that this will be met is motor vehicles. She never drove in this video, but she and a bunch of other people sat around and smoked at least 12 blunts together, and then they all got in a car, and now they're driving around. Who's driving the car? Are they high? So that to me would be a yellow flag on the field. But also, if she's smoking every hour, every day, and she's doing any driving, then she's probably already met this criteria. So question mark, but probable. Then the next one is a physical or psychological problem likely to have been caused or exacerbated. Well, the yellow flag on the field is the mom talking about the lung problems, the not being able to breathe. We know that there's plenty of research showing that marijuana use, especially chronic, prolonged, heavy marijuana use, is associated with greater respiratory problems. Not necessarily lung cancer, but other types of respiratory problems, like chronic bronchitis, for example, excessive coughing, wheezing, phlegm production, etc. Then we can move on to tolerance, taking more to get the same effect that she used to get from less. I'm just going to cut straight to the chase. Highly likely because you need 13 blunts to get high enough. 12 blunts, and she's after that saying, my goal is to get so high, I don't even want to go anymore. So you're not high enough after 12 blunts in a row. That's tolerance. And then withdrawal is a question mark because there's no evidence that she's ever stopped so far. She said this will be the longest I've ever stopped when she got to the treatment program, but we'd have to continue watching for the rest of the season to find out if we saw the symptoms of a cannabis withdrawal disorder. So I'm not saying, oh, I know that she's met all these with the check marks. I'm saying there were yellow flags on the field that would suggest it's been met or likely been met or possibly been met, but we need to dig deeper and get more information to know for sure. Now let's move on. Having identified these symptoms, we have to start with the severity. Let's assume that all these symptoms were happening within the same 12-month period. And let's assume that everything with a check next to it is a definite hit. That would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 symptoms, which would put us in this category, severe substance use, because 6 or more symptoms would be severe. Are we in remission? It says in early remission or in sustained remission. No, neither are true because she has not stopped for long enough. She's still having the symptoms. And in a controlled environment. Well, if she were in remission and she were in this residential program, then we would check off in a controlled environment. But she's not even in remission yet, so we don't even really need to tack that on. And then on maintenance therapy, well, she's not taking Suboxone or something like that, so we wouldn't say that. So what we have right now, if you put it all together, we have I'll just write it here at the bottom. We have a cannabis use disorder, severe. That is her diagnosis. If we were clear on all these check marks and that sort of thing. So hopefully this little exercise just gives you an idea of how you can apply some of the information that we brought up or apply the diagnostic criteria to formulate a DSM-5 diagnosis. And of course, it takes practice and time and familiarity to feel really comfortable with it, like anything else. Now let's go back to the slides and pick up where we left off. It's amazing how quickly time is going by and we still got lots to cover. Biopsychosocial assessment. So I like to review the client's biopsychosocial packet that I give them and ask follow-up questions during the clinical interview to help me understand the person holistically, to understand context. Let me just look at the chat box here and make sure I'm not missing something important. I've asked before, but why does the DSM always seem to have to leave the word addiction? Maybe you mean to leave the word addiction out, perhaps? Well, technically, the chapter that you find substance use disorders in is called substance-related and addictive disorders. So the word addictive shows up at least once in the DSM-5 to describe that category. But they tend to use words like substance use disorder, quite honestly, because it sounds less pejorative. Sort of like they got rid of hypochondriasis and replaced it with illness anxiety disorder because hypochondriac started to sound mean. Or they used to have mental retardation and they replaced it with intellectual disorder. Also, prior to mental retardation, they had idiot, imbecile, and moron as diagnoses. Well, those became popular phrases to use to insult people, so they changed it to mental retardation. Eventually, people started using that to insult people, so they changed that to intellectual disorder. And eventually, who knows, people might use that to insult people and they might change it again. So they constantly change verbiage in order to just to keep up with common vernacular or to try and reduce stigma attached to certain words. People have varying opinions about this, but they still kept the word addictive in the chapter categorization, is at least. And so the point is made by Ken that seems to actually feed denial. I think that is a valid point. All right, so let's go into structured interview tools. You could use a structured tool for your interviews if you don't want to use a tool like the one that I just went over, or your own kind of process in your head. Some examples are the Addiction Severity Index, or ASI. The Quick Use Social History is a psychosocial interview. And then the Texas Christian University has put out a free comprehensive intake form because it was funded through a research grant. And those are all things you can access. By the way, when you pull up the handouts folder, anything that you see that's red is a hyperlink, so you can click on it to access the website with more information about that resource. Let's move into ASAM treatment criteria. I love the ASAM model. I think it's great. I think it's holistic. I think it looks at the whole person. Dimension 1 is, what is their potential for acute intoxication or withdrawal? If the client comes to you and they are combining heavy quantities of alcohol and Xanax every day right now, can you recommend outpatient treatment for them? And then say, okay, now part of the outpatient program is you have to quit using and be abstinent. No, you really can't, because you could have a medical emergency on your hands. Alcohol and benzodiazepines are potentially deadly to withdraw from. When you have evidence that there could be withdrawal, then you probably want to get them to a safe medical detox environment so that we don't have a medical emergency while they withdraw. Some substances aren't as likely to produce medical emergencies during withdrawal, but some are more likely. The second dimension is biomedical conditions and complications. So do they have any medical problems, and how does that factor into their treatment needs? If, for example, you decide that somebody needs residential treatment, but they're also an insulin-dependent diabetic, will that particular residential treatment program give them access to a medical professional who can continue prescribing their insulin and monitoring them? If not, then it's probably not a good program for them. That's just an example. Dimension number 3 is the emotional, behavioral, and cognitive complications. Do they have co-occurring mental disorders? If they have schizophrenia, for example, and they need an antipsychotic medication, does this program have psychiatric staff who can provide psychiatric medication consultation? Do they work well with serious and persistent mental illness? What if it was a neurocognitive condition? What if you had a client who had virtually no short-term memory? Are they going to benefit as much from talk therapy? There's some interesting questions that need to be explored. Dimension 4 is their readiness to change. How motivated are they? Are they ready to change or not? Are they highly resistant to getting better? Because you might decide that somebody needs intensive outpatient, but they're not ready to stop yet. So, and you don't have any leverage. They're not mandated. They're a voluntary client, and they simply refuse to go to IOP. Maybe you park them in outpatient treatment for a while and you do motivational interviewing with them to try and help them resolve their ambivalence before you kick it up to IOP. Dimension number 5 is, what is their potential to either continue using in the current context or to relapse? The higher the potential for relapse, the higher the likelihood that they'll need a more intensive level of care, like residential, for example. And then finally, dimension number 6, what about their social supports? What about their living environment? Do they have a safe place? Do they live with a drug dealer who supplies them? Do they live with people who are using all day, every day, all around them? Do they have sober supports or not? That will play a factor in whether they're in a good enough environment or whether they might need something like residential treatment. So this is the very short version of the 6 dimensions. I will show you how to get trained to be more familiar with those 6 dimensions later on. We won't spend, I'll briefly say stages of change model is a great model to familiarize yourself with, because that helps you to decide whether they are ready for change, which is dimension number 4. I use the stages of change model to determine that. Pre-contemplation, denial, problem, what problem? Ain't no problem here. I'm certainly not considering changing anything. Contemplation, maybe I do have a problem. maybe I ought to do something about it. Preparation, yeah, I need to do something about this. I'm not ready quite yet, but I'm at least willing to start getting my ducks in a row or exploring my options. Action, I'm actually stopping or cutting back, and it is hard, it is not easy, and it's not comfortable. Maintenance, well, I stopped and I've been stopped for a long time, and now it's the new normal, and I need to maintain my progress. And then relapse and recycling, which is the norm rather than the exception to the norm. Continuum of care. These are the different levels of care in the ASAM model. We start off with level 0, which means no intervention, nothing going on here, no reason to do anything with this client. So if you're doing an evaluation and you don't have any substance use disorder diagnosis and there are no risk factors and everything seems to be great, you'd probably recommend no treatment. But 0.5 is early intervention. That means that you see risk factors. You see that there is a high risk of the client developing a problem with substances if we do not intervene. This is prevention. This is education. This is trying to keep there from becoming a problem because they seem to be at risk for developing one. Think of this as your, like for example, the DATE program, which is in Florida, a class that people have to take to get their driver's license to educate them on alcohol and driving. Well, now that they're going to be driving, that's a potential risk factor. You might conceptualize that as something close to a 0.5 intervention. Somebody gets their first DUI, and let's say that they don't have an alcohol use disorder, and this is an isolated event. Then maybe that would be a 0.5 intervention as well. Outpatient services are level 1. At level 1, we've determined that they either have a diagnosis or a diagnosis seems likely or it's provisional, or maybe we need more information, but we think that clinically they need something more intensive than simple education or prevention. This could be 1 time a week counseling intervention. It could be once every 2 weeks. It could be a few times a week. It all depends on the individual client. IOP in Florida, intensive outpatient, getting into the level 2s, 2.1, is defined as a minimum of 9 hours of programming content, usually group therapy. Oftentimes it'll be 3 days a week, 3 hours a day. This is for somebody for whom standard outpatient is just not enough. They need something a little bit more. The next level up is 2.5 partial hospitalization, and this is about 20 hours a week of treatment. This is the level that's used for people who are just shy of needing residential treatment. They are so close to needing residential, but they don't quite need residential, then this is the level of care for them. The level 3s are different variations of residential treatment settings, where you have maybe a residential program for somebody who doesn't have a co-occurring disorder. Then you might need one that accommodates people with biomedical conditions or co-occurring mental disorders, etc. And these are the people who they need to get out of the community for a little while in order to stop using and get balanced out enough and start getting some basic coping strategies, because they don't seem to be able to do it on an outpatient basis. Then we move up to level 4, which is a very intensive residential programs that are medically managed because somebody has a very serious, perhaps potentially life-threatening medical condition that has to be addressed alongside their substance use disorder treatment. So these are the levels of care on a continuum in the ASAM model, which is my preferred model. So when I make a recommendation on an evaluation, I'm naming these levels of care. And on these slides, you can see basically the stuff that I just got done telling you about these different levels of care. I do have a matrix in the handouts folder that kind of helps to guide you through these levels to decide what kind, in each of those 6 domains, what type of service they probably need. But we won't really have time to get into that today too much. But at least you know it's there and you're exposed to it. Now let's get into a review of records. Look at legal and judicial records. What's the exact nature of the client's current charges or case? What specific questions does the referral source want answered? And don't stray from that intended focus if this is a forensic eval anyway. Who does the report go to and what are the possible implications? Is there any history of substance-related legal problems? You can find that out when you go through the records. Did the client underreport their legal history during the clinical interview? I see that a lot. they'll tell me about maybe 2 arrests, but there were actually 10. They don't even know sometimes themselves how many arrests they have or when or what they were called. So then, how do you find public records? Okay, well, let's say that you know that a client was born and raised in Pinellas County, Florida, and they've never lived anywhere else. Then you can go to the Pinellas County Public Records website and you can get all kinds of information there. You could also, if they've been arrested recently, go to the Pinellas County Jail website and pull up a little bit of information about their arrest in most cases. The problem is clients who have lived in multiple places. You might have a client who's lived in 20 different places. What are you going to do? Go to 20 different public records sites and see if you can find something? Well, I'm a little embarrassed to say it because it sounds so cheesy, but there are these online public records search engines that are probably more designed for curious, nosy neighbors and stuff like that. But I subscribe to one of them called Truth Finder. And then I run their name in it. And then when I find public records that match them, then I go to the source of that record. Like, let's say it says, oh, Monroe County, Wisconsin. There was a disorderly intoxication charge in 2015. Then I'm going to go to the Monroe County, Wisconsin Public Records page and pull it from the source also. And whatever I find, I'm going to go back to the client and say, hey, I found this. What can you tell me about it? And get more information from the client. Now, Truth Finder is not gospel. It can have mistakes. It can confuse your client with somebody else. My informed consent does say that I will be doing online searches. I can look at their Facebook pages, their Twitter accounts, anything I can find on the internet about them is fair game. I had an evaluation, a DOT evaluation one time where the guy said, I've never used under the influence. And then I found his Facebook page, him bragging about driving drunk or driving high after smoking marijuana on multiple occasions. So I was able to use that, bring that information to him, say, hey, I found this, tell me more about it. Now, you don't do that for your therapy clients, but in our code of ethics, it specifically says that an example of a time when it may be appropriate to look for information about your client online is when it's necessary for a forensic evaluation to answer referral questions. And of course, you're going to have the client, that's part of your informed consent, is that they know that anything out there online is fair game. Treatment records. Here's a list of examples of questions when you're digging through treatment records to get more information. Did they say different things to the evaluator then than they're saying to you now? What was their progress like in treatment? Did they have drug test results? What was their prognosis when they completed? Did the treatment staff recommend any aftercare? And if so, did they do it? What are some of their identified triggers? What strategies did they develop in treatment that might help them to reduce relapse risk? Medical records. Is there any evidence of substance-related medical problems? Are there any biomedical conditions that we need to be aware of because that may play a role in what type of treatment setting is appropriate for them? Do they underreport to medical professionals? Like they haven't told their doctor about their daily alcohol use, for example, and so their doctor is maybe not talking about it because it's being denied. Collateral sources, other people who you may interview or talk to get information. It's like sometimes I'll have a client say, yeah, I probably have like 1 or 2 beers, on the weekends, but then I'll talk to somebody in their family who says, they're like, they're drunk like most days out of the week. They're intoxicated. Well, that doesn't mean that it's true, but that's one data point, and there might be others that converge to tell me the same thing. Oftentimes, multiple data points will converge to tell me somebody's underreporting. Like, well, they underreported compared to their treatment record from their previous treatment episode. They underreported according to their family members. They underreported according to their previous therapist. They underreported according to, and then if the consistent picture starts to emerge, then that certainly influences your opinions. When you're doing testing, it's important to be competent in the testing and to know enough about the testing, know whether it's an appropriate test that you're administering for this context. I favor the SASE 4 because it is a test that is designed to pick up on subtle attributes, things that are harder for the client to hide. It also can measure their level of defensiveness, their inconsistencies when answering questions, and it uses complex algorithms based on statistical data to conclude whether there's a high probability that the person has a severe substance problem, even if they're trying to cover it up. It's not, nothing's 100% accurate, but it's probably the best game that we have in town. Then the Maryland Addiction Questionnaire. I use that only if I've already concluded that they have a substance use disorder. The reason is that this test is normed for people who are in treatment. It's not normed for a general population. So don't use it to help you decide if they have a problem. Use it to help you decide what kind of treatment needs they may have. Like, will they likely be resentful in treatment? Do they lack motivation? Do they have social anxiety and may struggle with group therapies? Are they under a lot of emotional distress and need to be screened for co-occurring mental disorders? Do they think they have a problem or not? How much control do they think they have? Do they report high levels of craving and therefore high relapse potential? Those kinds of things. So it's a great supplemental test when you've already decided that they have a disorder. Here are some examples of other screening instruments. None of these have validity scales though. So a client can just BS their way through them, but they might be good supplemental measures sometimes, or a good measure to use with a client who's unlikely to underreport. And you can look at those later if you would like to. It's important for any substance abuse eval to at least screen for co-occurring mental disorders, because that, again, is one of those 6 domains from the ASAM model. You have to know if there might be a co-occurring mental disorder. There are some free measures you can use, like the DSM-5 cross-cutting symptom measures, or SAMHSA screening tools. You can click on either to get more information about them, and we have a whole separate webinar on how to use those tools, which you can access at nbfe.net for National Board of Forensic Evaluators.net. And there's a webinar there called How to Use Free Online Assessment Measures. Urinalysis drug testing, we won't talk about it right now because we don't really have time to, and it can get complex. In my practice, we use a lab called Redwood Toxicology Labs. We collect the urine specimen on site, we ship it off to the lab, and a forensic toxicologist reviews the lab report and then provides a confirmation. Over-the-counter dipsticks and screening tools are not good to use for forensic evals because you can have false positives and false negatives, and because they only test for certain substances. It's important to send the sample off to an actual lab and have it analyzed. It's very cheap to use a lab like Redwood Toxicology Labs that does not work with third-party payers like insurance because they're saving in all the administrative costs, and yet it's still an appropriately credentialed toxicologist signing off on the results. Now, for alcohol, don't just do an ethyl alcohol test. That only tells you if they're drunk right now, basically. You want to also do an ethyl glucuronide or ethyl sulfate test because that extends the biomarker, or that extends the detection period to roughly 72 hours or 80 hours or so, which is much more valuable for a substance abuse evaluation. The short story is, make sure you learn about urinalysis testing if you're doing it. And most, like Redwood Toxicology Labs, gives you training materials and information to help educate you on what things mean. And they're also available for over-the-phone consultation and explanation of the results. All right, so let's go into the evaluation report. If you are a certified forensic mental health evaluator, you have access to the National Board of Forensic Evaluators recommended test or report format. You might want to consider a similar format. Don't stray from the intended focus of the referral source. Diagnoses and clinical formulation, conclusion, and recommendation, those should all be seamless. There should be no surprises. You shouldn't read a report that says, yeah, they report drinking alcohol 5 times a week for the past 3 years. And then you get to the end and it's like alcohol use disorder. what are the symptoms? How do you know they have a disorder? All you said is they drink alcohol. That doesn't mean they have a disorder. So there shouldn't be surprises. Everything should be justified. Everything should make sense. There should be a reason for every conclusion that you draw. That's the short version, but we could do whole webinars on how to write a good report. A few rules of thumb when it comes to recommendations. A responsible drinking approach will sometimes and sometimes not be appropriate for mild alcohol use disorders. But generally, if the client has a moderate to severe alcohol use disorder, abstinence and recovery is the ideal approach, because the probability that someone with a moderate to severe substance use disorder will maintain remission long-term if they're still using the substance is very low. They tend to do it well for short periods sometimes, but it doesn't last. Treatment episodes should not be less than 90 days in duration. That's the minimum for even outpatient. So I always cringe when I see a report and it's like, yeah, like they should do 6 weeks of outpatient treatment for their alcohol use disorder, because that's already less than the minimum recommended time frame of treatment of 90 days based on a great deal of research on what helps people to achieve and maintain remission status. So we always do a minimum of 12 weeks of outpatient in our practice, but oftentimes longer than that. If you have leverage, use it. And if you don't, meet them where they're at. Here's what I mean by leverage. Client comes to you because they want to get their driver's license back and they've been ordered to do treatment in order to get their license back. You have leverage. You don't just do it their way. They say, you know what, I want to be done in 4 weeks. Let's make that happen. And then you say yes. You have leverage, so use it. Establish a clinically appropriate minimum time frame for treatment. Do your analysis testing even if they don't want to do it. Now, they can refuse to do the testing, but if they do that, then you can say that you're not going to provide treatment for them because you don't want to be in the position where you're signing off at the end and saying this person's been clean and sober and they're not a risk to the driving public anymore when you haven't even tested to see if they're still drinking or not and they have a moderate to severe alcohol use disorder. So these are things to think about. Generally speaking, prescription of potentially addictive medications should be avoided for people with substance use disorders. There are exceptions. I have so many clients with severe substance use disorders who now want medical marijuana because they really just want to keep using something. Or they want benzodiazepines like Xanax, Klonopin, or they want opiates for their pain relief or whatever the case may be. Ultimately, physicians have to make these decisions with clients, but from a substance abuse treatment perspective, you don't have to complete people successfully who are still using addictive substances when they have severe problems attached to them and their prognosis is not good. Now, what I do when I'm in doubt, when I'm like, listen, I can't really tell the client to stop using their addictive medication, but it's clear to me as a clinician that this is producing a problem for them and I can justify that, then I may require them to get a second opinion from a board-certified addiction medicine specialist. Those are physicians with expertise in addictions. They're MDs, so they can provide opinions about medication and what's appropriate medically, but they're also well-trained in addictions. For me so far, I've never had one disagree with my conclusions, but it could always happen. So that's a way to deal with the issue of, well, I'm not qualified to prescribe medication or tell someone to stop a medication or whatever, but I can't ethically and clinically justify treating or completing them successfully when they're still using this thing that's clearly creating a problem. Then you can get a board-certified addiction medicine specialist into the picture. So when you're providing recommendations, include the level of treatment, the length and duration of treatment, the intended focus of the treatment, the need for abstinence or sobriety and drug testing, whether they need dual disorder enhanced treatment for a co-occurring mental disorder, if there are any concerns about prescribed medication, the recommendations that should be adhered to, and include treatment resources when you have them. In other words, where can they go for this treatment? And then always specify that all treating professionals should review a copy of this report. Can't tell you how many times that somebody will do a great report and then it does nothing because the treating professional didn't ever see it. So the client comes into the treating professional and they just deny having a problem and they get completed quickly, successfully, when they didn't even address the problem because the treating professional did not have the information that you had and didn't know what they didn't know. So here's an example of a recommendations section from one of my reports with a false name and false circumstances, of course. Mr. Romero should successfully complete a minimum of 16 weeks of ASAM Level 1 outpatient substance abuse treatment focused on relapse prevention in a dual disorder enhanced program that can simultaneously address his co-occurring anxiety and depressive disorders. 2, Mr. Romero should maintain abstinence from alcohol and illicit substances throughout his treatment as evidenced by participating in random monthly urinalysis drug tests. I usually add, and that I recommend including ethyl glucurate and ethyl sulfate to the drug test as well. Mr. Romero should comply with any aftercare recommendations offered by his treatment team. This is critical because a client may go to an IOP program and the IOP people may say he definitely needs to still be in treatment and his prognosis is not good if he doesn't. But he says, I ain't going to outpatient treatment. And then the judge says, well, you did what the evaluator said you should do, so I guess you're good. But if I put this in, number 3, then I can ensure a higher probability that the system will at least know that it's important to pay attention to what the treating professional says the client still needs, and then they can make a decision on that. And then number 4, that catch-all, make sure whoever treats this client has access to this report. So critical because they have to know what you know to do their job. A couple of resources. How do you find licensed substance use treatment disorder facilities in your geographical area or that a client can access? You could use the SAMHSA treatment facility locator to find out what those programs are. I put the name and contact information for Justin Fraser of Banyan Treatment Center on this slide with his permission. I like to contact him or refer clients to him because he does a great job of keeping up on information about all the different programs, not only in the state of Florida, but also outside of the state of Florida. And so he's great at matching clients to appropriate programs and being a good resource there. And you might say, well, he works for Banyan Treatment Center, so isn't he just going to refer people to Banyan? The vast majority of the time he does not. There's still a good reason why he refers them to other programs, because that's good PR for Banyan when other programs are getting clients from them. So now I know I have moved so fast through all this and talked really fast, and we have a few minutes for questions. Also, got some resources to read more. Here's the ASAM criteria manual. For those of you who are interested in forensic evaluation, this is a good starter book to get into some of that information. The National Board of Forensic Evaluators, great resource, partnered with the American Mental Health Counselors Association, Florida Mental Health Counselors Association, and with our very own Suncoast Mental Health Counselors Association. They can get you training and certification to do forensic evals. ASAM does low-cost training on how to use the ASAM treatment criteria for assessment and treatment purposes. SASE does some great training on how to use the SASE 4 competently. And there are lots of credentials you can pursue in the world of substance abuse, including a new one from the American Mental Health Counselors Association that you can get called the Clinical Mental Health Specialist in Substance Use and Co-occurring Disorders. And now we are ready for questions. So let me go to the chat box and see what we got. I'll also go to the Q&A box in case. Okay, so some people have asked, where do I get the slides and handouts and so forth? So I have pasted that into the chat box, but I'm also going to show you the link on this screen here. Handouts are available at integritycounseling.box.com/V as in Victor/substance abuse evaluations. I think we can wrap things up. Then I know one more thing that I want to say. I encourage you to pay close attention to the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association website right now, because there are free trainings that we're doing on COVID-19 that won't cost you anything to attend. One of them is going to have the 491 board executive director, a 491 board member, and myself on a panel answering questions about COVID-19 emergency orders, laws and rules changes, resources, etc. And that's going to be coming up very soon here, as well as Dwight Bain is going to be doing a training on COVID-19, kind of how to get through these difficult times and to work with your clients. And there are just all kinds of other trainings that are going to be coming out and keep rolling out. And to get information on that stuff, you can go to FMHCA.org. That's FMHCA for Florida Mental Health Counselors Association.org. And then you can click on webinars, and you should be able to see all of those upcoming COVID-19 related trainings that are complimentary. Okay, I think, let me just check the Q&A box. Just some thank you comments. So we're good to go. Then I'm going to wish you all a very happy and fulfilling weekend. Keep sticking together because that's how we're going to get through this very difficult time for our profession and for the world. And I very much look forward to seeing you all at the next SOMCA event. Have a good one.